Hello and welcome back to our Enterprise Universe channel. With us again is Dr. James Stalker. We've been talking for the last few sessions about climate mapping and country mapping and how the two relate. And today we're going to wrap that up by having a more in-depth discussion about the value of the country mapping and how the country mapping relates to global mapping. So welcome again, Dr. Stalker. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. When we look at the climate mapping, I think there might be some confusion about how the global mapping and the climate mapping map together at the country level. It is true to say that the country maps are valuable in and of themselves. That is a true statement, correct, Dr. Stalker?
That is actually true, Eamon. So what I want to do is encapsulate some of the ideas we went over in the last segment.
Right.
And then I will do part two and how the climate stuff relates to countrywide mapping and vice versa. Okay, so there's some point that I want to talk about. You know, we did 30 years of simulations for the country of Ireland in our last discussion.
Yes.
And we also talked about potentially including 100 use cases or areas of application. And 10 of those would be tackled during the 2 to 3 year time frame that we also set out for that project. Of the 10, obviously, you are going to have a lot of input as to which ones are your top items, and we're going to recommend based on what we have seen. And I also want to make sure that those 10 items are tied back to your GDP growth.
Correct.
How you're going to increase your GDP and by minimizing losses and so forth. So those are all part of that development. So we're not going to just say you're going to get 1% GDP just flat out. We want to do the analysis thoroughly during the 3-year period in which items of interest to you, items that we believe will yield the growth rate that we're talking about, those would all be delivered to you at the end of the 3-year period. But one other point that I want to make there, Eamon, is that when we make the recommendations, you still have to make the proper adjustments and the changes that you need to make, and also the investments. For example, it's something to do with the renewable energy. Unless you do all of those things, your GDP is not going to grow just because you have our recommendations and our data and our knowledge base. So I just want to be clear about that part. Go ahead, Eamon.
So I think one of the things that people just be clear, when we say climate map, it's really a dynamic climate map, right, Dr. Stalker, where we're constantly updating the maps and we're running the simulations. So it's not like it's not like a static map that people will get. This will be a dynamic map looking into the past and looking into the future, correct?
That is correct. So I will come to that when I talk about the climate map and linkages, but I want to clean a few things up because I think we're going to wrap up this discussion after this segment, and we'll go into the scientific discussions I've made in Boston back in January.
Right. Perfect.
So GDP I talked about. So our projections are only based on the analysis that we're going to make for the 10 items. And if there are other items that are going to yield more GDP growth, then we will recommend that to you. It's up to you, of course, which ones you want to use or focus on, but we will recommend ours. And it's an ongoing process after the 3 years, you know, for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We will be doing that on an ongoing basis, including or in addition to your resources and also the resources available at your universities. So that's really a collaborative effort when we move past the 3 years of this project engagement. So, and you know, there are some things that you brought up. Am I really concerned that, you know, if my model is open to the world, you know, some people want to do it and this and that? I actually told you that's not my concern. My concern would be actually not delivering on the product, because it takes so much effort. It's not just running the models or producing some results. It's really about understanding the results and what to do when those results are not adequate. And that type of expertise is not available. It's not easy to get. It takes a lot of time. Even with my training, for them to reach that optimal level takes, I believe, 10 years. So I just wanted to make that clear there,
So
okay?
the thing I think that causes concern, especially in Europe these days, is the melting of the polar ice caps, and people have a concern that there's going to be a significant climate disruption if we have no climate or if we have no ice caps. So I guess one of the things is, while that the concern there about the global map is that if you don't have the global map, you won't be able to see the impact of the of like net ice loss over the Arctic on Ireland, because Ireland's very much affected by the North Sea and the Atlantic current, and the so therefore melting of the it's not an academic. It has potentially significant climate impacts on Ireland. And I think that would be the concern about not having the global perspective in conjunction with the country perspective, because people are worrying about things like, well, it's not, maybe in 15 years, we're going to have another loss, we're going to have more significant loss of ice cover, and what impact might that have on the Irish climate in the not in the distant future, in the next 15 years. How will that progressively impact us in Ireland?
It is a great point, and I want to cover
Yeah.
that in part
Sorry.
two when I
Oh, I apologize.
tie it
I
back. No,
apologize.
this is actually a great point. Actually, it's one of the main points that I want to talk about when we tie it back. But I want to wrap some things up here, Eamon, because we touched on so many things. We talked about uh, a lot of things about my own evolution and all of the learning that occurred. I have to be upfront that I have benefited from a lot of teachers, mentors over the years, and I don't mention their names, not because I don't appreciate. I just want to do that for privacy purposes. So there are lots of folks out there that I benefited from, and I hopefully also help them understand my viewpoints and my discussions and so forth over the years. So I just want to put that out there because these videos are going to be watched by not only non-technical people, but technical people as well. In that vein, Eamon, I also want to appreciate what NOAA does. For example, NOAA resolution, I talked about, 55 kilometers, which is true, but that really provides the baseline for what I do. For example, that is considered part of the 10% data, even though that's coarse, it's not available, but the gradients available in those coarse resolution data sets are what I will be using for my simulation. So it really provides the baseline, even though the paradigm shift for what I'm doing is really going from observation centric to modeling centric. Now, the observations alone with the small sandbox inside from the model, that's not going to do it unless you are happy to get extrapolated values. But I'm changing all of that with the model-centric paradigm shift where I'm enabling the underlying physical processes. So I just wanted to make sure I'm covering all the bases and giving everyone the credit where the credit is due. So I just wanted to make sure of that. And we can go into part two now, but I'll answer any questions you might have.
Right. I think that's really just a really important point. And I think it's worth reiterating over and over again that your model leverages the observations that are available in the little box, but because you're able to do the modeling, you're able to create the big data box. But what you're trying to do is recognize the contribution of the data that you are able to use to seed your models to create the bigger data sets. And another differentiator of your approach is that you use all of the good data that's available, you use So some of the smaller models don't even use all of the data that's available. They only use a subset of data, while you use all the data that's available and then blow it out to the big box using the physical processes as the basis of that, while other models don't even use all the data that's available. Is that they don't even use all of the 10% that's available? So you're using the 10% and blowing it out to the 100%. Unfortunately, a lot of the other models only use 1 or 2% of the available data and then just extrapolate versus using the fundamental physical models to create a complete data set. Have I got it right eventually? Is that more or less correct, Dr. Stalker?
You have gotten it right. It's absolutely true. And I will point back to one of the examples I used that would encapsulate this idea. For example, there was a location A with 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and using the current models, it gave you 60 degrees. But the actual measurement at location B was, let's say, 79 degrees as an example. That difference of 19 degrees is not available to anyone. Nobody would be able to do that. And that's where the Stalker method, based on which the RESTpert platform has been developed, it's able to get from the 60 closer to 79, but I'm not saying it's going to be 79. So it'd be closer to 79 than closer to 60, but the current methods are not able to get you there. And that's really the big difference. And the reason for that is one is based on extrapolation. The other one is based on incorporating the underlying physical processes and thus computational demand for doing that. So that's really the differentiation.
And I would like to say that other parts of the world are starting to look at this type of an idea, not in the context of climate, but I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that we're dealing with a very small fraction of the data. I was looking at a thing on asset management, for example, and they said that to properly manage, let's say, a pump, you actually need 792 attributes, but people only have 62 attributes. So like on average, they kind of did a thing. How many attributes around pumps do you have? Well, there's 62. Well, to do a good job, you'd need 790. So I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that there's a huge data gap. We've got a huge data gap, and we have to fill that data gap. And you've got a method to fill that data gap. And I think that's becoming recognized in other spheres outside of yours. But it's a huge kind of like, oh my God, what's going on? And I think that's a fundamental shift. And I just wanted to make sure that the listeners, I keep reiterating it, partly because, Dr. Stalker, I'm trying to reiterate back to you, so I'm reflecting back to what you said. But I think taking that one step forward, going back to the, okay, now we understand a little bit better. We've filled in the data gap for the country. It's really critical to understand what use the country is going to get out of the data set now that it has it. Because I can speak for the Irish context, at least. I think there's tremendous concern in the Ireland right now. We've got the Greens have come in as a part of the government, and there's a commitment to reducing carbon 7% a year over the next 4 or 5 years. The question is, how can you achieve your climate goals without wrecking the economy? And I think that would be one of the areas, at least in an Irish context, that I would have seen, like, it's back to that thing, do you kill the cows? Do you plant a forest? Do you go after the cars? Like, what makes sense? And again, I think that would be one area where your technology would be able to help countries like Ireland navigate this treacherous without, frankly, destabilizing the society by causing, trauma to the economic system. As we've seen, trauma to the economic system results in political instability, and we really have to avoid that, I feel. So I think, at least from my perspective, maintaining some level of social equality and maintaining the economic engine going forward as we make this transition seems like an incredibly important use of this information.
I think that's another point that I will bring up climate to
Yeah,
the
yeah,
one how I'm going to linkage it.
yes,
Eamon.
sorry.
So one point I will make is in terms of data paucity, the small amount of data to support my colleagues all over the world.
Mhm.
They have always known that there aren't enough measurements. That's not something new. But what's new with what I have done is how much that percentage of 90 for weather and even smaller, a higher percentage of gap for the climate. That's something that I define based on my expertise in computational fluid dynamics. So I give them that. So I'm not saying they weren't aware. Maybe they weren't aware how big of a gap. That's one thing. And also, current models allowed by the science, they were thinking they could fill the data gaps just from extrapolation or interpolation alone. Some models actually incorporate some type of modeling capturing physical processes, but what they do is without realizing what the models are doing, they cannot even take advantage of the small amount of data available. So that's the other thing that I was talking about, smearing the benefit versus actually enabling the benefit like I do from the Stalker method. So
Right.
that's something that I wanted to make sure everybody understands, because I'm really getting nitty gritty now because I want to wrap this so we can move
Yeah,
on.
absolutely. And to reiterate that is that the computational fluid dynamic underpinning and the ability to use computational fluid dynamics to fill the data gap is perhaps something that people don't realize is possible. And what we're saying is that through the Stalker method, you are able to fill the gap, but only through computational fluid dynamics that are based on modeling the real physical processes that are going on in the climate and that are based on the rate of change of the variables that you can actually measure. And I think that's the basic fundamental paradigm shift that the method entails. And that's a very, very, very big change over the current methods. And people are doing the best they can, but until you make this paradigm shift, and that's the word we used, I think, the last time, Dr. Stalker, there is no from here to there. Um, you know, you have to make the leap to actually doing the hard work of modeling the physical processes and doing the computational fluid dynamics and focusing on using the data you have to fill in, to seed the model so you can actually do the computations. Not an easy task. Very,
Uh,
very difficult. And the most difficult thing I personally find about it, Dr. Stoker, is that you have to be a polymath to be able to do this because there's so many different forces and so many different computational elements that you have had to obviously, be a little bit of an expert in many, many fields in order to pull off a model that even comes close to reality, let alone something that's actually predictive.
I totally appreciate that, and I think you summarized it really well, Eamon. And one other thing too, you also have to be able to have the desire to push the boundaries, which
Right.
is something that I have done all my life. I'm comfortable pushing the boundaries because that's where I play. I
Yes,
don't really,
absolutely. And that
yes.
means you're beyond the horizon of the published material.
If
We're
you
out in the
remember
new realm.
that, yes,
And
that's
the only
exactly
real
what it
way to
is.
prove that is by basically showing the results. It's like
Absolutely,
the
absolutely.
results speak for themselves.
Yep, that's exactly what we did. And, again, one more point is that what I have done, the Stalker method is not just for weather or climate alone. It is for any type of fluid. Engineering flows in pipes or over aircraft, you name it. All of those things have the same limitations because the limitation is in the science, not the
Yes,
methods or the application areas.
right. Absolutely. I can imagine there being a lot of chemical engineers right now who do analyses of things like refineries and stuff, saying, "Wow, I wonder how this could change how we do our analyses," because they're all basically fluid dynamic and chemical processes. So,
it
which
is
is
going
essentially what the
to
atmosphere is writ large.
it is going to make a huge impact
Right.
In terms of the new approaches. Of course,
And like,
implementing is
right. We're almost like there's a term out there in the science or in the tech world today where they talk about the digital twin. It's almost like you're building the digital twin for the country, where you're able to basically the digital twin. The idea of the digital twin is it came up in like aircraft engines, where you would actually be able to understand the what's going on with the aircraft engine in real time. You couldn't actually measure what everything that was going on in the engine, so that actually run a simulation in real time, so you actually see what based on the measurements what was actually happening inside in the engine. And I think what we're talking about is the climate, a digital twin essentially for the country. And there's there's a well-known use case actually for the digital twin, and I just happen to know a little bit about this because it's a part of my field. But like Dr. Stalker, they're talking about 40 to 50% increases in efficiency from having these digital twins just for like turbines and equipment. If you take that analogy and you apply the same kind of analogy of the digital twin for a turbine to what you're doing with the climate, that you take those, all of the advantages of the digital twin just go skyrocketing through the roof, because you're dealing with the ability now to understand the dynamic behavior of the climate versus just being a victim of the climate, and then being able to then use that for all of the economic value associated with running more efficiently, making sure the engine lasts longer, being predictive of maintenance. All of those same kind of concepts that you have with a physical digital twin would be analogous, I think, to what you're looking at with the application layer, quote unquote, of the Stalker method.
That's a good segue into the second part I want to talk about, Eamon, because when you have that ability to quantify the climate change as we know it, perhaps is cooling, not warming, because we're projecting that based on the small amount of information and our approaches, and we're coming up with a warming trend. But when you actually do it system wide, including the oceans and every place else, that quantified understanding may lead to a different conclusion than warming. It may be cooling. So we really have to think about that. When you said what would be the value of a digital twin like what you talked about, that would be the value. It is actually going to point to the right trend. So any measures that you're going to take to curb it or mitigate it, it would actually be meaningful, because in the end, you want to make sure you reduced your 7% carbon a year. Is that really going to impact the type of impact you're looking for? If the answer is no, you don't know how to do that, that's really a wasted effort, and you don't even know if that's going to enhance warming. So those are the things that I would like to talk about in this part. So so let's, if you have a quick question on that, Eamon, I will answer that, and then we'll move on.
There was one question I had, and it's probably a very stupid question, but in the continental US, it seems to me that the weather's driven a lot more by the continent than it is by the oceans. But while if you're at the ocean, it's more driven by the ocean. Is that a fair statement that like weather is more variable when you're at a water land interface than it is if you're like in the middle of a continent? It's more predictable. Is that just ignorance on my part, or is it true that certain countries would have more predictable?
To an extent,
than
you
others?
are referring to the heat capacity,
Right,
of the water versus the land, because land could receive a lot of energy but give out the energy quickly, which is not the case with the ocean. So they have the capacity. That's why they're
right. And I guess what I was just trying to get at really was, will some countries have more predictable weather than others, just by virtue of their geography and their physical position? I guess that's really what I was getting at. Is that a true statement?
It's kind of hard to say because
It's hard to
all of
say.
them are difficult.
Right. Yeah. No. No.
Because they
So that's
all
hard to
have
say.
different
Okay. Sure.
processes
Well,
ongoing.
then
Of course,
forget
with the
about it
Stalker
as a.
method, you might be
I was
able
just
to quantify that.
I was just wondering. And it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. No, let's move on to topic number 2.
Okay, so
Dr. Stalker, I
topic
think we've
number
spent long
2
enough on.
really, Eamon, is to tie it to the 30-year data that we're going to create for a country like Ireland. Okay,
Right.
so what they can do without participating in the global leadership and solving the climate change. I just want to make sure those data sets are still highly valuable for you, but there are some things you would not be able to do. And I want to point out what those things are. So let's just say we got 30 years and we have the variability of 30 years, year over year at any location. You take one variable like wind speed or temperature or precipitation, you are seeing that variability year over year for the 30 years. So you have 30 data points, temporally speaking, if you average for the year, but we're going to give you data at every hour. So you have so much data that you can analyze and get the average. And then you could say 2019 was below average or above average because you actually know the true average now, unlike in the past. So defining the true average and also getting the statistics like it's above average or below average makes sense, unlike now. So that's something that you know now. How can you use that for your use cases? Is something that you can do a lot for renewable energy, agriculture, water resource management, or even resource planning, like developing sources and sinks to make sure you are trying to mitigate some of the effects that you think you are producing from your fossil fuel consumption, for example, or energy generation. These are the things that are happening now that you can get a handle on with the 30-year data sets. And you also come to another point about updating the data. This is not a static data set. You have it and that's it. No, in 2021, we will add another year to the 30-year data record. And we will be doing that on an ongoing basis. We don't know what the contractual obligation might be for how long, how to price that. Barring that, just a year of data sets added to your system each year is another benefit that you're going to get. That's the thing.
So how far out, Dr. Stalker, does the model go in terms of like, would we? I know you can I know we've talked about this before, and I know that the accuracy is is obviously going to tail off. But as a service in the Irish context, obviously we can see the trend, but are we what kind of forecasting timeframes are we talking about for in an Irish context, like 30 days, 60 day, 90 day, even out to a year? Like what kind of forecasting, how far out do you think would make sense before it becomes so kind of, it's just, the model starts losing its coherence?
Based on what I have done so far, and the samples are not a lot, it's only one project, 6-month forecast I did for a wind farm, operating wind farm in Texas. From that, my projected error statistics were better than when the results came back, I was doing better than what I projected. So that's the first thing. So I'm comfortable to say I could do a seasonal forecast anywhere from 6 to 9 months, which is highly beneficial.
Which is huge. Yes, absolutely.
Planning purposes.
But even just being able to correlate the detailed forecasts in the past back to events in the past, one would be better able to understand what the impact of the weather is on things like agriculture, for example. So one could get a better understanding of, growing seasons and the climatic impacts on different types of crops, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the backcasting could be very useful in terms of really understanding the relationship between things like crop yields and climate conditions, between rainfall and flooding and these other events, so that when we do the forecasting, we have a much better way of projecting. Like, because if we don't do the backcasting and start understanding the relationships, when we get the forecast, we won't be able to say, well, what does that mean for agriculture? What does that mean for our river systems? What maybe does that mean for our marine, that storms and storm damage? All I'm just saying is that the ability to understand the impact will be able, and have that in some detail, we'll be able to use the data better on the front side as we seasonally kind of move the clock forward and assess what. So it's both a back and a front. I think you can use the data to understand better, as you say, the trend and the averages and the kind of the big arrows, and also the short-term impact, because it does seem to me that the climate is changing in Ireland, but people have a very hard time in understanding what's really changing. And I think that's absolutely true. That there was a study done, for example, off the west coast of Ireland, where they had these huge rocks, and what they did was they measured the position of the rocks from year to year, and they found that the rocks were moving a lot more than they thought they were, which is kind of a proxy measurement for, oh shit, I think the storms are getting stronger, or the storms are getting weaker, whatever it was. But like, the bottom line was, nobody had ever measured the fact that the rocks were moving around. And like, some of these rocks were pretty big, and they were moving a couple of feet, every year. And like, because if on the west coast of Ireland, you got these big plateaus and the cliffs, and then they leave a kind of a plateau, and then there are these rocks, and then the waves come over the rocks, and then they move them around. But I think to be able to correlate that and really understand, yeah, the storms are getting stronger, or the storms are getting weaker, will have a big impact for things like infrastructure planning, because you will actually be able to see a trajectory. My brother actually works on restoration work for the Office of Public Works, and they're very worried about what type of investments do they need to make to protect the landmarks of Ireland. And I think such a kind of a trajectory, you should be more worried about rain. You should be more worried about this. I think having real data around the weather, the microclimate, as it would relate to, because like the weather in Shannon Airport doesn't necessarily tell you a whole lot about what's really happening at the local monument. So I think that's the kind of thing where I would see the Office of Public Works would be able to take this and understand the direction and make better infrastructure investments at a particular point, not just based on macro trends.
Yeah, one of the big things that comes out of the 30-year data records, Eamon, that I'm going to create is we could actually, for the first time, quantify what the true average is. That's not possible through the science and the methods and the observations available, because it's only guessed at every location where you have no measurements. So that's one thing that would fall right out. And you might say, why is that useful? It is useful because when I say next June is going to be above average, I have to make sure that average is true too. Otherwise, it does not even make any sense when come June of next year, it's below or above average that you weren't able to even define. So right. That's how important it is. So there's no way for you to plan anything, because you cannot define it's going to be a wetter year or drier year, because yes. You don't know how to define the average. And that's one of the main benefits of doing yes. this. But the challenge is still left for you are this, and that's how I want to tie it back to climate, why climate is so important. So we see the variability is there from year to year. Let's just say there's a trend line. It is like precipitation. It's going down steadily over the 30-year period. Okay, that's a trend that you should be worried about, because it's getting drier for you, because you're moving toward drought. But would we be able to attribute that to climate change? That answer is not possible now. We could say it's varying with a greater degree of accuracy, but we would not be able to attribute that change, that trend line to climate, because we haven't done the rest of the climate to be able to ascertain that for sure. And
Well,
that's really the
yeah.
challenge that we have. And that's why you need to participate in the global leadership, not because it makes you feel good. It is also
Get to
practically
the root
important.
causes. Yeah, we have to get to the root causes together, I guess. And just from the thing that I find most compelling is the whole, like, and I like high school physics type of idea of the radiative forcing of associated with additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I know the atmosphere is way more complicated than just carbon dioxide, but that's being offset by things like cloud cover and other variables. So I think it's a tremendously complicated process, but I have to say that I think that the basic idea that we're if cloud cover and if we can get a handle on the drivers of climate and at a global level, we will be in a much better position to act effectively to mitigate those. Because one of the things I worry about is that we focus too much on climate change and not enough on, the fact that we've got 9 billion people on the planet is bound to have, like, irrespective, it's not simply just carbon dioxide. It's like, I think it's a little bit of a we tend to get mono-focused on one thing, and we say, well, and I know it's easy and it kind of helps us set, it kind of gets the global community organized around but I think there's a problem there of not understanding the true drivers and understanding the true trends, and therefore, maybe even doing more harm than good, frankly, as it relates to some of our quote unquote, as I've said to one thing, you might actually be better off having more aerosols in the air from coal plants than shutting them down if it reduces some of the global dimming associated with aerosols. Or, so these are the kind of complex interactions where, yeah, it seems really smart to me that we all drive electric cars, but if we are creating some kind of other, because we're mining all these rare earth metals and that has some other long-term effect, that may actually not be a sound strategy. And I really do worry that unless we have this digital twin and we understand what's going on inside, we run a terrible risk of doing the wrong thing for the right reason, and but it's still the wrong thing, Dr. Stalker. In the end, it's like, I get it. We were trying to do the right thing, but if it's the wrong thing for the right reason is still the wrong thing.
It is, and politicians and policymakers obviously want to simplify the message so
Yes.
they could, beat it down to
Yes.
the masses so they understand it. And there are some prices to pay for doing that, especially when the science isn't there to support your simplification. So you're oversimplifying to the extent where, as you said, you take some measures that could really have negative or unintended consequences, and you would want to know more about that in the context of climate.
And my own view is that what country wouldn't want to have, and using this analogy again of the digital twin for the country, why wouldn't you want, how could you not, especially given that we're so, we run we're in a highly complicated civilization now that basically we can't take as many risks we've been having. It seems to me like the technology you're talking about is fundamental to our future. And I know I keep beating on this drum, and I know, Dr. Stalker, you don't like to go too far out, but I just feel that in future generations, they'll look back and say, this was absolutely fundamental and obvious that this was needed. But how come we're having such a hard time on getting the people in the present to understand the absolute need of this? When I think if we put ourselves out 10, 20, 30 years, the people of the future would say, well, that's obvious. Like,
Well,
what is happening that in the present we're having such a hard time explaining what you and I would think is an obvious statement that you need to do this. It's kind of obvious, but yet we're still having a hard time getting.
I think we need to be patient, Eamon. It's really practice over many decades. You know, there is this thing about familiarity. We don't want to do things differently. We don't want to try anything different. So
Yes.
that's there. That
Because
inertia is
I'm
there.
I'm looking forward to the day when we get the weather forecast for my neighborhood, and it's an output of the model, And here's what it's going to look like for you tomorrow, versus here's what it's going to be, in your area, your region.
I
That
will
would be
be
a
able to
nice.
do that.
That would be a symbol for me that we had moved to this new paradigm, and that you could actually rely on the weather forecast for tomorrow versus it being I have to take my umbrella out every day. Like the Irish weather forecast, it's like I'd advise you to take your umbrella with you no matter what the weather forecast told you, because the experience has said that it can be raining on you. It can be blue one minute and be raining on you the next. So I think, though, in my view, Dr. Stalker, there is economic value in it, but it's kind of, we're selling something that I think, in fairness, in future generations, people will say, well, that's obvious. It's like not having health insurance or not having, basic, a telephone. I think it's going to be like that in the future, where, how could you get by in the time before telephones? Well, we're in the time before the country mapping and how everything in the country is going to be influenced by this, and the global economy as well.
Yeah.
I don't think we can survive as an interconnected civilization without this technology, honestly. And that's why I'm so
Absolutely.
excited about what you're doing, Dr. Stalker, because I think it's absolutely pivotal at this point in history. And I do believe there's also incredibly tactical value in doing it. It would pay for itself pretty much in the first 6 months, as far as I can see.
Absolutely. I mean, if I could put my
Yeah.
objective hat on, which I
Yeah.
think I could,
Mhm.
I would say it's indispensable
And I
for the
think
world. Not
I
because
think
I
it's
developed it and I'm pushing it. No, I'm not. I actually developed it to solve a problem. I recognized the problem, and that's why I developed it. And I took my time over the many years with the struggles and whatever. I did that just because I knew what the significant issue was. I did not develop this and I'm looking for a problem to solve. No, that's not how it happened. I actually recognized the problem and then I developed it. That's why it's indispensable.
And I like to put it too in the terms of national security, because not to give it away, Dr. Stalker, but I know you've been having discussions with a large entity, and they've been talking about the fact that people's lives are being lost because we don't understand what's coming or what's going to happen, or we don't have accurate figures, even so we can take preventive measures. If you think about the fundamental role of government being to protect people from a national security perspective, I think this is a national security issue, because it's about protecting the lives of the citizenry. And isn't that what national security is? National security isn't just, I think there's less of a threat to the citizenry from the country next door invading than there is. As a matter of fact, if you look at South America, there hasn't been a major war in South America in hundreds of years. I think it's quite possible we could get to a rather stable situation with respect to geopolitics, but the real national security threats will be more of these type of, the result of our civilization and human development. We need to save our citizenry from the unplanned impacts of our civilization, and I feel that would in fact come under the rubric of national security myself.
I
it
think
raises
so.
to the
Just
level.
optimization alone, you're optimizing your resources, getting better and improving your GDP, that's fine. But the other flip side of that is minimizing hardships and the losses and
Yes.
even losses of lives and all of that. Those are, essentially the technology would be able to improve on the lead time. And let's
Yes.
say tornado is going to happen in 10 minutes or 15 minutes versus maybe an hour. That's
Yes.
a huge impact. Similarly, hurricanes and other flooding and those sorts of things. So it has that benefit also, not only to increase productivity, but also minimize losses. So you
Yes.
have a double whammy effect in terms of getting this to benefit yourself.
So I would
So
see it as it'll be an indispensable part, in my view, of the function to protect and serve, if you will, the community, to have these types of features in the future. And it's my hope that governments will take up the call, because I think this should be a public good in that sense rather than a private good. Because certainly, Dr. Stalker, you could probably make a lot of money by just selling this to the folks to make money. But I don't think that's your vision. Your vision is to make it a public good. That would be a true statement.
that is a true statement. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I struggled. If I
Mhm.
were to say create the data and monetize it, make them pay for the same data over and over and over, I will be making a lot of money. But I'm not really interested in that. What I'm interested in is to really make, as you said, public good. They have to pay for it. Obviously, there's cost involved and the effort that we put in and all of that. But when I'm creating value, I don't feel too much about the price points
Yeah.
that I have, because the benefits are going to outweigh the cost by 50 times, 100 times. If I don't sound like I'm exaggerating, it would be more than that, because over a period of time, you're talking about significant value added to your GDP and managing and protecting your people and your property and so forth. So that's really what the benefit is.
Correct. And we do not want to end up like the uh, pharmaceutical companies, where they're now spending more money on advertising than on research and development, when one would have thought that with scientific benchmarking and stuff, one surely could prove one way or the other whether a treatment was effective.
I,
You know,
I have some really
it's
strong views on the pharmaceutical industry. We'll talk
it's an
down the road, but
anti-pattern,
but
perhaps. It's what we don't want to have happen, I think, with these
I
climate
agree.
technologies,
I agree.
because if it becomes like the pharmaceutical industry, will be, people will be dying and they'll be gouged for what should be a public good. I think that's basically. Now, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't get rewarded for their research and their patents, but it means that spending half your money on advertising is not a great way, I think, to do
No,
public good.
that's absolutely true. In fact, I have some issues with weather businesses out there.
Yeah.
They're giving you weather data for free. And again, I'm not picking on them, but that's the business model they use. But they're making money from through online ad revenue.
Mhm.
They're not actually making money from the weather
Yes,
data
sure.
themselves. So that's kind of ironic when you look at it, which is something that I don't want to do.
And we
But
all know that the distortion, the distortion of free. Free isn't free, unfortunately.
it is
And
not free
we
at
have
all. You're
I've had some very strange experiences with Google giving me, pushing content to me that is just like the algorithm's the algorithm, but it's kind of like, there is it really isn't helpful to be the way those things work. I think we're at the point now where it's we have to make sure that the business model, and I think we've talked about this, Dr. Stalker, about the fundamentals and the public good, and that's why I think you are very focused on the country mapping, because it should be a public good at the country level in its optimal form, and that would drive the best value for everybody.
It is true, and once the country governments get the data and our expertise, they will be able to include all of the other players, private sector players, renewable energy people, telecommunication people, whatever. They will be able to use the data for all of their benefit. In fact, those who are able to engage in applications, they will be able to monetize that. So there is a lot of benefit, secondary benefit. But I would rather approach it from
I
that
think
perspective.
climate fear will be a dominant political theme here for the next 10 or 20 years. And anything we can do to basically help people feel like they're more in control of the situation and not just victims of like runaway climate change, I think that's going to help us have like scientific and rational conversations versus rushing out potentially making very poor decisions at a political and an economic level. And really, I think we need to get ahead of this before it turns into a crisis that's out of control.
That's a great point, Eamon. So let me tie it back to what I was saying. Let's say from the 30 years, just precipitation alone for Ireland, we have seen the trend going down. So it's getting drier each year over that line. There's a fine trend. But we would not be able to attribute that to a climate change because we haven't done all of the analysis globally. But when the global mapping has been done, I would be able to point out specifically why Ireland is getting drier each year.
Yeah.
Is it because of what your neighbors are doing, or is it because of what you are doing, or is it a combination of both? Those things would be quantified better than now. You can't even pose that question because there isn't enough information. That's one point. The second point is, let's just say we agree that, yeah, you want to be a leader in the world and you want to take care of the planet. Now you want to put some measures like 7% reduction in carbon year over year, but you do not know, using the current science and the methods and the observations and models, what that's going to do to your trend line, one, and also how that's going to affect the whole thing globally, even if it's a minor effect because Ireland is relatively a small country, but you still have to be able to track the effect back to climate change.
Right.
So that's another thing that you need to have, why it's so important to have the global mapping for both reasons to determine what you have, and also your mitigating effects are not only benefiting you, but benefiting the entire climate. Those are not possible right now.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't think we have any idea, as you said, what the real impacts of shutting things down are, let alone turning things on. And that's one of the things that, again, that I worry about is that I agree in the abstract that, to certain statements, but I am not sure that they are actually the best policies. So it's very hard to say what the best policies are without better information. And what might appear on the surface as a good policy may actually be a counterproductive policy unless you do the science and unless you do the proper analysis. And I just fear that, that's the thing, again, that it's not just that I think the world is at the point where we're ready to do the right thing. But if we do the right thing and have the wrong results, it's just as bad as if we did the right thing and had the wrong results, or the wrong thing and got the wrong results. The ultimate, it'll still be.
That is absolutely true. That's my worry too. That is my worry also. That's one of the reasons why I'm saying this is indispensable, not because I developed it. No, I developed it because of the problem, not because I developed it and now I'm looking for a problem to apply this. That's really not how it happened. That's why I say it's indispensable, because we want to make sure, let's just say in the next 10 years, we're mobilizing everything. We got the maps and everything else. If we don't do that, let's say we are going to stay with the current science and the path we're on, after 10 years, we would have spent a lot of money. There's no
Yeah.
doubt. It's not lack of money that we haven't solved this problem. And then, of course, a lot of issues about, countries fighting over each other and who is doing what and all of that. That's going to continue, but the problem is never going to be solved in the end after 10 years or beyond. So that's one reason why I'm saying now it's a small amount of funding that's required to do it globally. And you might say why I'm insisting on global mapping, because even though we establish with the current science, current method for your country, the trend line, I would not be able to tell what
What the root
caused that
cause, yes, right. And
without doing the
causality,
global.
and I think that's a big problem that we have in our discussions today, is that people people attribute causality to correlation. And causality isn't the same as correlation. And I really feel that unless you understand the underlying physics, you cannot speak to causation. You can only speak to correlation. Just because they seem to be related doesn't mean they are related. And I really feel that that is the root cause of actually the conspiracy theory problem we have, which is that the human mind, I could say, Joe was in Daly Plaza at the same day John F. Kennedy was killed, and Joe was also at, somewhere else the day they tried to kill Ronald Reagan. That yes, there's a correlation there, but that doesn't imply causality. And that's where I think all this conspiracy theories come up, because we can cherry pick data and correlate them, but that does not mean we have any causality. And this is something I think you as a scientist must lose your mind over, because this is my biggest problem, is that I can see correlations, but I don't know about causality. And this is the terrible situation we're in, which is, and I think that's the ultimate problem with AI, by the way, and machine learning, is that they could create a lot of false causal links, which may actually be true, but not for causal reasons. They're true for other reasons. And then when you turn left, the brake, but the model will say it goes forward, but actually it goes like this because there was no, that they weren't, the causality wasn't this way. It was like, and they just happened to have parallel drivers, but there wasn't any correlate. And I feel that's a terrible, and I think that's a problem with the human mind, and the difference between science and the human mind is science strives for causality. The human mind searches for correlation, and infers causality.
Let
You know
me
what I'm
give
saying?
you
And I think that's a huge problem we have, is like I've struggled with this myself. Just because they happened at the same, just because the moon went down and I got hit over the head, doesn't mean that the moon going down and me hitting it over the head are correlated, or are causally related. But I can correlate them. But
I can give you a good analogy here, Eamon, to really encapsulate your point. Let's say there is an expert on a subject area that's presenting on a topic. Okay, so AI is used in that context. Who is reacting
yes,
to that discussion? Whether
yes,
how they're reacting and how to flip those charts
yeah,
faster or slower depending on the reactivity of your audience. All of those things could be done by AI, but the
yeah.
real knowledge coming out from that expert talking about what the subject area is, you cannot replace that with AI. So
And
that's really the
that's
difference.
my number one concern, is that we'll throw a bunch of money into AI, and it'll ultimately give us bogus answers, because it's ultimately, look, it's not doing the science, it's not doing the causality, it's not doing the fundamental physics, and we will end up with a bunch of, you know, yeah, kind of like add words type technologies that are just basically, yeah, Joe goes out in the morning, but it doesn't talk to causality, and I think what works in a commercial sense, you can't use that to be doing science with it. And I think
The, the,
that's
the
that's
broader the broader point in the analogy too, Eamon, and you would agree with me,
yeah.
is that there is a role for AI to play.
Yes.
There's absolutely a role. We would use them within the enterprise universe, but I would never let AI stuff touch real human beings.
Yes.
When they call the enterprise universe, some robot is not answering.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
person who is
And
the
I think
person,
we could use AI in the application layer to, like, as I said, understand strong correlations that are likely causal as a result of, let's say, crop yield versus rainfall, etc. But we'd never use it to basically do the climate modeling itself,
no,
because the climate modeling is based on the physics. But where we don't have the physics, we can basically, make as strong as possible correlation, but know that it isn't causal. It's just, we need to just know what it means, things that are science based versus things that are mathematically correlation and based, and just know that, hey, look, this has got an asterisk over it. We haven't done the fundamental physics, but we think there's a connection here, versus this is where we're using the core physics to work out the core model, and making sure that, and then this is an unknown domain that needs further physics work to get to actually understanding the true things, and then you replace the AI with deeper understanding. I just want to make sure that people don't think AI is understanding. It's not really. It's
no,
just it's connecting the dots.
no.
It's not understanding why the dots were there in the first place.
Yeah. So to elaborate the point that I was making,
Yeah.
anyone called the enterprise universe, a human being would
So
answer,
answer the
but that
phone.
human being is going to use AI techniques to prepare himself or herself. I'm not opposed to preparing someone so long as they are able to question what's good, what's not good. But in terms of interacting with the outside world, it's not the AI. We're not talking to a machine. Machines are used to prepare yourself, but not to talk to the outside world. So that's really what I see as the relation.
Yes, because ultimately we always got a consciousness talking to a consciousness. Like, ultimately, at least in our dialogues, there's humanity on the both ends. There's we're connecting as human beings, and I think that has to stay, because if we don't have that, we end up having an echo chamber, in a sense, of the robot reflecting back to the human, versus there being a true human to human. And I think that's part of the problem we're having, is that when you have technology echoing back to the human, it becomes it's not good for the human. Actually, the human needs the human, the spirit needs the spirit, that the subjective consciousness needs the subjective consciousness. Otherwise, it's kind of like a mirror that's reflecting back to you, and it's actually there's and I think history will prove that there will be a backlash in the future against exactly what you said, Dr. Stalker, which is that humans we should have humans on the other end of the line, because machines will just accentuate things that are already in us, like racism or fascism or whatever. I think there's a real chance that it's because it's reflective rather than responsive, if you will. It reflects what I want back to myself. Somehow that seems to amplify some negative things for us humans, and I think
I
we should always put humans to humans.
I think that's a great point, Eamon. I think I was trying to unravel this in our early
Yes.
segments,
Yes. Right.
where robots are programs. They're
Yes.
nothing but programs, computer programs written by human beings. That's the first thing. And the second thing is robots are never going to be consumers. They're
Yes.
only to serve the needs of who? The human beings. So that's the thing that we should never forget. And also, I emphasize this a lot. If there's anything to celebrate in this physical universe, it's human beings, humanity.
Right.
We're not ever going to celebrate, how much robotic power we
Right.
have. That's really, nobody's going to talk about that.
And
How
the
we're going
and
to
the
elevate humans is really the main thing.
Yeah, and the mystery of existence, and that we need things like what you're coming up with, Dr. Stalker, to keep this wonderful, magical experiment that creation has created, which is we call consciousness and conscious beings. We need to keep that going. We need to keep that. We need to protect it. And I think what you're doing here is fundamental to protecting consciousness in human beings and liberty and freedom and all the good things that humanity's about.
Okay.
So
Thank you, Eamon. I'll make one more point on the robots versus experts. If I get one server to do my simulations versus somebody doing 1,000 servers, I will do a better job with one server than somebody using 1,000 servers. It's really not the computing power. It's really your power, your mental abilities to understand what's going on. So my results are going to be better from one
right.
server than from the 1,000 servers somebody else uses. And that's the point that I'm making. It's not about the computational power. It's about your power of understanding, which
And
requires a
that
lot of hard work. Don't get
right.
me
And,
wrong.
and that's what I do worry about in terms of computing, as computing looks to abstract and make it easier. It's actually like low code, no code environments. You have no idea what's going on behind the scenes, and it could have systematic errors, and you could never tell. And I think there's a real danger with the way we're approaching technology today, that as we layer these stacks of abstraction on abstraction on abstraction, that essentially there'll be future generations may not have any real idea how the damn machine works at all. It's just an abstraction for them. It's almost like some kind of Kafkaesque situation we're running, where the machine says it's 42, and no one really knows why the machine came up with
You know,
42.
I,
And
I, I, I think I have, that's a great point, Eamon. I have spent enough of my career on this. We're definitely going to make sure it's going to be used by
right.
everyone. There's no doubt in my mind about that, because I did not spend this much time